Good, welcome. Welcome to the first talk that I will be giving in a series of three about the Holy Week rites as we now have them in the church and as we now celebrate them. They're designed to be an introduction to the rites as we will celebrate them here at St. Stephen's House, and also an introduction to their historical development and their context within the life of praying Christians in England and elsewhere in the world, to explain how the Holy Week rites came to take their current form. It's very good to have with us those who are following via the Edward King Centre online, and I hope these talks will be useful and will be beneficial as we all prepare as Christians to celebrate these very important rites and ceremonies in the life of the Church. I normally begin these talks by saying that the Holy Week rites are some of the oldest rites that we celebrate as part of the liturgy of the Church. Some of them date back to the early 1950s without having been changed. And I think I just want to start off by saying that I think clergy in parishes can sometimes be quite discouraged by the degree of enthusiasm and commitment that lay people sometimes have to these rites, and feel a bit sort of let down that the whole sort of summit of the church's year can sometimes go a bit of a damp squib. People go on holiday, the weather's bad, etc., so on and so forth. And I want, I suppose, to say in a rather sort of, to sort of cheer people up a little bit, to say that actually these rites as we currently have them essentially date, in particular in terms of the time of their celebration, to the mid-1950s. 1956 was the first year, really, in which the Holy Week rites, as we now know them, were celebrated at the current time of day, and in the form with which we are basically familiar. That's the year in which the Holy Week rites in the Roman Catholic Church were very substantially reformed and changed. Of course, those rites were in Latin and not translated into English until 1970, when further changes were made. But I do think it's very important to remember that these rites essentially date from the mid-1950s in the way in which they shape Holy Week and the way in which people's participation in them has come to be as it is now. The Easter Vigil is a bit of an exception to that. The Easter Vigil was first allowed as an experiment in the way that we now know it in 1951, and then that experiment was extended, firstly for 3 years, then for one further year, and then for good from 1956 onwards. And so some people, not very many because it was optional, would have experienced the Easter Vigil for the first time in the way that we would recognise it at Easter 1951. But for most people, Easter 1956 was the year when really significant changes, compulsory changes, took place in the Roman Rite. And that very much influenced particular Catholic practice in the Church of England, because in the Church of England it was the usual custom, you'll see this in the English Missal and elsewhere, for the Roman rites to be adapted, translated into English and used in English churches. Although that was by no means a uniform practice, and I'll talk a little bit about how the Church of England observed Holy Week as the talk develops. So important to remember that these rites, although they contain various ancient features, are largely a product, in terms of the experience of the whole week, of the mid-1950s. And that also, the way in which they were reformed in 1970, emphasises active participation by the laity, and also emphasises what you might call liturgical action over the blessing and consecration of things. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about how the rites changed, say, for Palm Sunday, in which very elaborate rites for making sure that the palms were blessed are replaced almost in their entirety by a rite that proposes not the expelling of demons from the palms, but rather the procession and so on and so forth. And so we'll see how that works as we go along and we talk about the various rites. So important to remember that, and I think it's important that from a point of view of pastoral practice, we have to remember that the memory of embedding of these liturgical rites is not actually that deep. It's not actually that deep in the Church of England. It's not actually that deep in the universal church in that respect. The Holy Week rites are very much a product, I think, of their times. And so it's important to recognise that, whilst also encouraging people to benefit from the very rich liturgical, pastoral and symbolic formation that they give us in Christian catechesis and in following Christ in his passion in Holy Week. So that's the most important thing I want to say to begin with. What was the experience of Holy Week then in England before the Reformation? Just to put in context again, what did people see as being most important? There were really three factors that we can see when we see Holy Week described in the devotional manuals, the rather rich devotional manual life of medieval England. Three things that particularly stood out and which are not features, really, of the Holy Week rites as we know them. The first thing was the Palm Sunday rites, which were incredibly important in medieval England. We have lots of descriptions of how those worked. And they were essentially a combination of what we would see as the procession with a sort of Corpus Christi procession. It's evident that in churches that had the resources to do this, the rite on Palm Sunday consisted of a procession leaving the church and then meeting a procession of the Blessed Sacrament, and then there being a sort of exchange of covered and uncovered crosses, and then the sacrament proceeding back into church with the singing of Hosanna and with children throwing cakes at people. That was quite popular in some places as well. Children would stand on a little hillock singing, holding palms, and chuck cakes at people as the Blessed Sacrament was carried back into church. So rather typical late medieval religion in that sense. But the Palm Sunday procession certainly in late medieval England had a significance and that was much greater, in fact, than the sort of procession that we now, and much more elaborate. It made much more of an impression on the devotional temper of the time, if you like. The second thing that was really important was creeping to the cross on Good Friday. We have this to some degree with the veneration of the cross, but it's evident that people went barefoot to church, that they had their legs uncovered, and that they would sort of crawl to the cross, making several genuflections, and then venerate the cross on Good Friday. And that was another thing that stuck very strongly in the popular imagination. What didn't seem to have any impact at all on the popular imagination was the ceremonies of the Vigil on Holy Saturday. Very important to remember that because of both climate and the rules about fasting, all of the services for Holy Week took place in the morning until the 1950s. And so the Easter Vigil, the Holy Saturday ceremonies all took place in the morning of Holy Saturday. And we can see, I think, by comparing the rites in the Dominican Missal, which were very similar to the Sarum rites, that the blessing of the fire and so forth was quite an exiguous ceremony in the Sarum rite, in comparison with what was much, much more important, which was the ceremonies attached to the Easter sepulchre. So we know, and that we watch after Maundy Thursday Mass, before the Blessed Sacrament until midnight. In the Middle Ages, the public watch, had a much, much more important emphasis on watching before the sacrament from after the Good Friday liturgy until Easter morning. And then on Easter morning, a sort of resurrection ceremony took place, in which the host contained in the Easter sepulchre, which was a sort of wooden construction, was opened, and the sacrament was taken back to the high altar. In some places like Durham, I think it was exposed in a monstrance shaped like the risen Christ. And the cross, which had been used for the veneration on Good Friday, was also taken back to a place of honour. So those are the three things that we know were most important in the Middle Ages with regard to the observance of Holy Week: the Palm Sunday procession, the creeping to the cross, and the Easter sepulchre ceremonies, none of which actually are quite present with us now in the way in which we observe Holy Week. All of this was abolished in England in 1548, in one go. It all just went. The council said, we're not going to do any of this anymore. And so the observance of Holy Week in the Anglican tradition, in the prayer book tradition, survives but is very exiguous. There are texts, but there is very little by way of ceremonial. For example, the Sunday next before Easter has really no reference to the Palm Sunday, either the Gospel or the ceremonies at all. In the Book of Common Prayer, what is preserved is simply the reading of the Passion readings on the Sunday next before Easter, and then on the Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday there are liturgical texts provided so that the Passions are read. On the Thursday before Easter, which is not called Maundy Thursday in the prayer book, there is in the epistle mention of the institution of the Lord's Supper. There are 3 collects set for Good Friday in the prayer book, and this represents the solemn intercession that was proper to the day, and which continues to be present in the rite for Good Friday. Those 3 collects represent themes. There's prayer for the conversion of the heathen and so on and so forth. And then, of course, also the reading of the St. John's Passion. There is a reference to baptism in the texts for Easter Eve. And there's also just a very, very tiny reference to the great Easter Sepulchre ceremonies that we know of from the Middle Ages on Easter Sunday, on Easter Day, because instead of saying the Venite at the beginning of morning prayer, the Easter anthems are used. Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us, therefore let us keep the feast. And we think that in some places that this was what was sung when the Easter sepulchre was opened and the sacrament was taken back to the high altar. So there's just a tiny little sort of chink, if you like, of light coming from these medieval ceremonies into the prayer book office, which is a very austere one, although it does make seasonal provision. But like all the seasonal provision in the prayer book, it's seasonal provision that's very cerebral, it's very text-based rather than ceremonially based. We think that really up until the 19th century, the only liturgical observance of Lent that you would have noticed in an Anglican church, whilst there wasn't a service going on, was that those churches which use crimson hangings and cloths and altar cloths would have changed them to black during Lent. But you wouldn't have seen very much more than that. So there is an observance of the season in the Church of England after the Reformation, but it bears very, very little resemblance to the extremely elaborate ceremonial that was used before the Reformation. Under the influence of the Oxford movement, we see throughout the 19th century one of the aspects of ritual revival is that the Holy Week ceremonies come to be used again. Firstly, we see the use of the 3 hours devotion on Good Friday, which Gregory Dix is very funny about this. He used to say, because people saw the 3 hours devotion, which is 3 hours of preaching about the 7 last words of Christ, etc. And the 3 hours devotion, Gregory Dix, the famous liturgist, whose lectures that became the shape of the liturgy, I think were given in this chapel actually, when they were originally given. And Gregory Dix referred to the preference of Anglican bishops for 17th century Peruvian Jesuit devotions. That's where the 3 hours came from, rather than the actual liturgy of the church. And so Dix was teasing, as he liked to do. But it is the case that the 3 hours devotion on Good Friday was something that was common to many churches, even outside those that have been most influenced by Tractarianism. But we do see the actual rites of Holy Week coming into use, although the Vigil, these Holy Saturday ones, were probably the very last ones to come in. It is the case that when the Commission on Ritual, the Royal Commission on Ecclesiastical Discipline, reported in 1905, it said there were certain things that should never, ever be allowed in the Church of England, amongst which they particularly mentioned the veneration of the cross on Good Friday. But no one took any notice, and that's now, really quite common, I think. Even in cathedrals, you'll see the veneration, the adoration of the cross on Good Friday. And so we know that that was going on in 1905 because people were trying to ban it. And we also see the other things, other developments. Bishops used to be very reluctant to have chrism masses. That's changed. Most dioceses now have a chrism mass. And it's also the case that the official texts of the Church of England have by careful use of the canonical position to have allowed services rather than authorised services, nearly all of the material for Holy Week has now been allowed for use under Canon, and that's been contained in books. First, it was contained in the book Lent, Holy Week and Easter, which was a very useful resource that came out, I think, in the 1980s, and latterly in common worship as well. Important to remember, though, that all those services are allowed by Canon rather than authorised, and so they don't actually have any more or less authority than the texts that are contained in the Roman Rite. They're just conveniently put together in a book that is has a sort of penumbra of Church of England approbation laid over it, but that's how it works. So really, over about 100 years or so, perhaps a bit more than that, 130, 140 years, we've seen gradually the readoption of these services, but in particular since the 1950s, because the issue about time and the issue about popular participation have been addressed in the Roman Catholic Church and in the Church of England as well. I'm going to pause there and ask if there are any questions, anything arising from that would be helpful for me to add any more clarification if I can.
Well, some churches, think the Easter Vigil is celebrated before the sun rises on Easter Sunday. Mm-hmm. Is that partly containing a folk memory of that morning service?
I don't think at all. I think that there is absolutely no folk memory at all the Easter Vigil is a creation of the liturgical movement essentially from the 1950s in that sense. In Europe, it was clearly not celebrated anywhere other than in the morning from, the late Middle Ages onwards. There may have been a few places where it was a bit earlier in the day, but, actually, I think that, a lot of the provision for the current Holy Week services depends on electric light and efficient heating. And also the changes in the 1950s, particularly in the Roman Catholic Church, about the Eucharistic fast. An evening mass wasn't really feasible if you had to fast from midnight. But when the rules about that were changed by Pius XII in the early 1950s, people got used to going to mass in the evening. I used to know a priest who was a member of the Confraternity of the Blessed Sacrament. He joined in 1925, and he said, I prayed for 30 years every day that evening communions might cease, because evening communions were considered to be a deplorable mark of low church, provocation, particularly evening communions on Good Friday. And so it was a real change. It was a real shock to the system, I think, that people found it possible to go to Mass in the evening. But then that opened up all sorts of possibilities about, say, the Vigil and things like that. But I think that there is no collective memory. There's certainly no literary or there are no medieval, I can't think of anything that sort of is evocative of thinking about, the light and the darkness or things. I just think the Vigil had become an entirely archaeological piece of work. And its principal purpose was to make really powerful baptismal water. That's what it was for, so that you had your baptismal water for the rest of the year. But I'll talk more about the Vigil and its restoration in the third talk.
The prohibition on venerating the cross from 1905, how do we know that no one took any notice of that?
Because it didn't stop, basically. It was a report of a royal commission, and so they said, we need to enforce ecclesiastical discipline. There was then, and that began the row about prayer book revision, which lasted until 1928, and then in 1928 the revised prayer book was rejected by Parliament, and so really it was some bishops would have caused trouble about it, others wouldn't have done, but most of the clergy, would have just stuck their neck out and said, I'm going to do this, I don't care what you think, and as a consequence of that, I think, it's sort of gained momentum in that sense. The word adoration, of course, is tricky. I mean, there's a whole theological problem about that because, of course, St. Thomas Aquinas says, well, I think adoration comes from adoratio, meaning to sort of reverence with a kiss, but it becomes, it does sound slightly odd in English to say the adoration of the cross. But Truro Cathedral puts that in its order of service, and other people put veneration. But I think that because St. Thomas speaks rather oddly about how veneration of the cross is a true adoration. I think theologically it was a bit controverted at that point, but, in lots of places. I mean, I can remember going to places in the 80s where the cross was brought into church with "Behold the wood of the cross," and then the cross was sort of put at the front, and then you didn't have to go and kiss it. You could look at it, or you could go up and you could hold it. I was sort of very English, sort of shaking hands, or you could do that, but they didn't have a sort of formal kissing. The kissing was considered, when the kissing had to stop, it was considered to be a bit much. So yeah, I mean, I think all of these things find their level in different places. Like some parishes would have a baptismal thing or a vigil on the evening of on Easter Eve, on the evening of Holy Saturday, but wouldn't have the Mass because they didn't want to spoil the 8 o'clock the next day or whatever. So there's that variation. Okay. Good. I'll go on to talk a little bit about the rites themselves then and how they have changed. Father, might I ask you to shut the door? That'd be all right, sorry. Up until 1956, the rites for Palm Sunday were extremely long and complicated. Basically speaking, what happened was, and took a very late medieval form, and so the rite began with essentially what was used to be called a missa sicca, a dry mass, a celebration of a rite that was just like a mass, including a preface and the singing of the Sanctus and everything. But instead of there being a Eucharistic prayer, there was a powerful blessing that would be given to whatever object that you were going to bless. And in this case, it was the palms. One of the oddnesses about this rite is, of course, because the scriptural evidence is for palms and olive branches. The people who were doing the prayer said, we can't use a prayer for palms because that won't work on the olive branches, and, we don't want them not to be blessed, and if they're not blessed, there might be a demon lurking in it, and when it's handed to you, that's it for you. And so there's a very strong exorcistic emphasis on the palms, getting the demons out of the palms and then giving them very strong blessings so that when you get your palm, it's a sacramental and it benefits you. And so the whole emphasis of the rite until 1956 is essentially, sorting out the palms and the olive branches so that they're powerful bits of kit when you get it. And the procession itself was a much more exiguous thing. Normally the procession just went round the inside of the church. Although there is a very beautiful ceremony in the pre-1956 rite, I should say pre-1955, it was published in 1955, in which a party of people goes inside the church, and then the procession comes out of the church and arrives at the door, and then All Glory, Lord and Honour is sung antiphonally between the people outside and the people inside. And then at the end of that, the subdeacon strikes the door with the foot of the processional cross, and the door opens, and the choir inside sings, "Let him enter the King of Glory." It's a very late medieval ceremony, a very beautiful ceremony. There are, these pre-1956 ceremonies have all been revived a lot recently, although there's being another clampdown on them at the moment. And so there is a lot of, Father Christopher, who was here on sabbatical, his church did. There's a very good video of that ceremony a very good film of that ceremony on his church's YouTube feed. You can see the dialogue. It's lovely. It's a lovely moment when they sing to each other with the door shut and then suddenly it opens. But basically speaking, the Palm Sunday rites until 1955 weren't very interested in the procession, but were extremely interested in sorting out the palms. And then everyone had to go up as if you were receiving communion, and you would receive a palm in that way. So by the time you'd done all of that, you'd been in church for about the best part of an hour. And then there was this short procession, then you'd have Mass. And then you would have also the other distinctive part of the Palm Sunday rite that we know of is the dramatic singing of the Passion. The singing of the Passion with 3 deacons, ideally, dividing it up. Again, that's quite a late medieval thing. In other places, 1 deacon would sing it in the Ambrosian rite, which is used in Milan and the churches associated with Milan. I think it's still the case that 1 deacon does the singing, but then there's a very elaborate ceremony when the Lord's death is announced. In other places, at Seville, they would have the veil of the temple. They'd have the Lent veil would drop or be divided in half. All sorts of late medieval ceremonies associated with Palm Sunday. But basically speaking, the rite until 1956 emphasised blessing the palms and the olive branches and sorting them out. Palms not available in lots of places. In England, people used to carry pussy willow and also used to carry box as well. In 1955-56, the emphasis was moved to the procession. People were encouraged to be outside, to move from one place to another. The blessing was reduced to the sort of blessing that we now know, that very simple blessing where people would just, you could distribute the branches in that rite, but also we get this new thing, which is that you come in and you have your branch already with you and you hold it up and the priest blesses it. The ceremony with the door and the dialogue and knocking on the door is abolished, and the covering of the processional cross is abolished, and also the holding of palms during the Gospel is abolished in 1955. It was made very clear that the rite was 2 things. You had the procession with the palms, and then that stopped, and then a Mass of the Passion which followed after it, during which the palms had no longer anything to do. So the lovely pictures that you can see of people all holding branches at the Gospel instead of acolytes' candles, all of that is, all of that dates, back to before the mid-50s in the Roman Rite. The only change that was made in 1970 on Palm Sunday was that because there was an assumption that people wouldn't come to church on Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday in Holy Week, we now have the varying passions. And so year A, year B, year C, Matthew, Mark, Luke. So there's no longer a fixed gospel on Palm Sunday. And there's also as we had the St. Luke's entry into Jerusalem, which of course doesn't mention palms at all, which we had this year, which just goes to show that actually the 3-year lectionary is not the most perfect thing in the world, but that's what we had this year. So that's how the Palm Sunday ceremonies have developed. So originally, right up until the 1950s, a very, very, very long rite designed to make palms holy. And then after that, the sort of rite that we're now familiar with, in which people, accrue donkeys and walk around outside and do those things, but where the actual blessing is extremely businesslike and extremely short. So as we experienced with our brass band on Sunday. Any questions about Palm Sunday?
That exorcistic rigour applied to the palms, was that unusual in that they didn't use the same kind of rites for other sacramentals?
No, I mean, it's very common of the old Roman rite. So candles, candles on Candlemas, the palms on Palm Sunday. The whole emphasis is very strongly in the Roman Rite, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the chrism as well and the consecration of those things. Is material stuff is important. It's very classically Roman in that sense, that you have stuff, but demons lurk in stuff, and you've got to sort of prize them out, get them to go away, like the fire, like the Paschal candle. You've just got to make sure that you've got this thing, in the realm of blessing, if you like. And so there's a lot of, the clergy come along. The clergy's job is to sort of come along and sort out this stuff so that it's safe to be handed to other people. And then the other people have this stuff, which is great because it's been blessed, and then you can use it for important stuff because that's what the prayers say, and that's the job. So it's all very much, and when we talk about the old Holy Saturday rites, that's all about making sure that, there are no demons in the salt, there's no demons in the water, there's no demons in the fire, there's no demons in the candle, and that then all these things are blessed. Whereas now the tendency is to be a bit embarrassed about all of that and to just say, well, hold the stuff up and then I'll bless it and then we can go and do something together, That's the emphasis now. Whether it's going to the font or whether it's carrying palms or holding your candles or following the light of Christ. So it's a very different mentality. And it represents a very different mentality that is, a mentality of our age, if you like. How are we doing? I just want to talk a little bit also about Maundy Thursday. I don't want to talk about the actual evening Mass yet. I want to talk about some rites that are associated with Maundy Thursday. In particular, the blessing of the oils on Maundy Thursday, the reconciliation of penitence, and also the foot washing ceremony. These ceremonies move around quite a lot during recent years, and it's quite good, I think, to be able to just fit them together. Till 1956, there was no separate Chrism Mass. We know that in Rome, there may have been 3 different sorts of text for use on Maundy Thursday: a Mass for the Lord's Supper, a Mass for blessing oils, and a Mass for reconciling penitence, perhaps. But these weren't all said by the same people. And it seems that what happened is that the Pope just said one Mass at noon, at which he blessed the oils, and then various other sort of stuff happened, but into the liturgical books, it was the papal Mass that became the one that became fixed in the Roman Rite in regard to its texts. And so until 1956, there was just one Mass in the morning for Maundy Thursday, and if the diocesan bishop was celebrating it, he celebrated it and blessed the oils. And the oils were blessed in an extraordinarily complicated set of rites, which involved 12 priests. The rites themselves were quite simple. There was one exorcism and one blessing for each of the 3 oils. The oil of the sick was blessed during the Canon. There's that bit in the Roman Canon, per quem hac omnia, by all these good things. And that was, we think that in that moment in the Roman Rite, when the Roman Canon was first used, everyone would sort of bring goodies to church and sort of hold them up, and then the priest would say, per quem hac omnia, and they'd be blessed, and so then you'd take all your bread and your stuff away after Mass. And it seems to be the case that the oil was blessed at that point as well. Oils were blessed. So the oil of the sick is blessed by the bishop on his own at that point. So he stops saying Mass, he leaves the altar, comes and sits down, with lots of flunkies, and blesses the oil of the sick. Exorcises it, demons out, blesses it, please use this to make sick people better. Then after communion, the bishop then blesses with great solemnity both the chrism and the oil of the catechumens. And this involves both the bishop saying the prayers and the 12 presbyters coming in pairs and breathing into the oil of the chrism and then genuflecting to it afterwards and singing to it. You have to sing Hail Holy Chrism or Hail Holy Oil. And they come and do all of this, and there's much kissing of jugs and stuff. So that's how that worked really until about 1970. 1956, when the evening Mass of the Lord's Supper was restored, a separate rite for the Chrism Mass with texts was used, but basically speaking, the blessing happened in exactly the same way until 1970. In the Church of England, Chrism Mass is really only sort of got going in the 50s. I have a letter from Arthur Curitin written to the Bishop of Llandaff in the 50s, in which the Bishop of Llandaff says, what do I need to do about this? And Arthur Curitin says, you need to buy 3 sweet jars, 3 glass sweet jars, fill them up with the 3 oils, put 2 of them on one side of the altar, 1 on the other, say Mass at 7 o'clock in the morning on Maundy Thursday. You're not having people driving all the way in from Abertillery or wherever that is, all those places. It's just you in your chapel in Llandaff. And he said, when you get to the end of the canon, take the lid off the one for the sick and say this prayer, and then put it back on again. After you've received communion, take the other 2 lids off, say these prayers, seal them up again, and then get your chaplain to send the oil round to whoever wants it. So that was how it started. In the Church of England and in the Church in Wales. But since the rites were reformed in the 1970s, we've seen more people using Chrism Masses in the Church of England, although many bishops required a great deal of persuading to take Chrism Masses before about 1990. In 1970, the Chrism Mass rite was completely abolished and replaced by much more simple rites of consecration and blessing. And also by analogy with the renewal of baptismal vows in the Vigil, the renewal of priestly commitment was introduced to the Chrism Mass as well. It is meant to be a renewal of priestly commitment. It's not meant to be a renewal of diaconal commitment or episcopal commitment or reader commitment or all of those other things. It is simply meant to be a renewal of the commitment of those in the presbyteral order. But that's a very recent thing. That came in 1970. Other aspects of Maundy Thursday, the reconciliation of penitence was always done on Maundy Thursday. And although by the late Middle Ages, because private confession had come in, that didn't happen very often, the rite for reconciling a penitent and the publication of certain formal bulls of excommunication always used to happen on Maundy Thursday. And right up until 1970, there was a form for reconciling penitents in public by the bishop on Maundy Thursday, which was contained in the Roman Pontifical. Last but not least, I want to talk about the mandatum, the foot-washing ceremony. The foot-washing ceremony was essentially, until 1956, extra-liturgical. It wasn't something that happened during the Mass of the day. And it was something that superiors did to inferiors, if you like. So if you were a monarch, you did it to your subjects. If you were a religious superior in a monastery, you would do it to those under your authority. It was essentially a way of those in authority making an act of service to those who were under their authority. It was not something that was to do with parish churches. And largely by 1570, by the time that these rites were codified, began to be codified in the liturgical books of the Roman Rite, it had become a clerical thing. So the Pope just used to wash the feet of subdeacons, I think. And in some places, I think in the Ambrosian Rite, as I mentioned before, lay people's feet were washed, but it was essentially become a clerical thing. In 1956, that changed. And it changed in quite a radical way, because in 1956 it became permissible for the mandatum to be included in the evening Mass as we know it. But it also became the case, and this was the first time really this happened, that lay people could go into the choir of the church and have their feet washed by the priest there. It was really the first occasion I can think of, other than to go up to receive Holy Communion, in which lay people took part in a participatory rite in the sanctuary of the church. And that came in 1956. It wasn't compulsory. You could still do the mandatum as it had been done before, as a separate service, normally in the afternoon of Maundy Thursday, but you could incorporate it into the Mass. And that incorporation into the Mass continues as we know it now. The law of the Roman Rite still says that the 12 people to have their feet washed should be men, but the Pope has decided to do that differently now, so that's a law largely not observed in that sense. But again, important to remember that before 1956, the washing of feet was not part of the Eucharistic liturgy. It was a rite that was done separately, it was a para-liturgical rite, and was not a major feature of the Holy Week observances. Although now it is, I think, probably one of the more popular aspects of the rites as they're now observed. But that's where that comes from. So really I want to talk about Maundy Thursday in that sense up to and including the mandatum, and then tomorrow I'll talk about how the rites of Maundy Thursday, the Mass of the Lord's Supper in the evening, relates to the Liturgy of Good Friday as well, because the two have to be celebrated together really and form, as it were, a unity in that sense. Any questions about that? Father.
When the extra-liturgical rite of the mandatum was conducted by monarchs, was there a spoken formula? Were there liturgies as we know it, or was it more?
Yeah, there's a set liturgical form which involves various psalms and prayers. which, you know, would be carried out by the monarch's almoner generally, and then the monarch would either wash feet. I think William III abolished foot washing in England. I think James II was the last monarch to actually wash feet. But the giving of the money, which used to take place after the foot washing, you would wash the foot and then give the gift. So in Rome, I think they had a dinner for the people whose feet were washed, or people were given a new suit of clothes or things like that. You know, that was always part of it. It was meant to be this service of the superior to the inferior, if you like, or to the advantaged to the disadvantaged. And so in England, the foot washing went, I think, with William III. Who obviously did not come from that sort of liturgical context. But the giving of the money, the giving of the gift after the gesture remained and remains quite an important part of public piety in England now, with the monarch doing that.
Maundy Thursday the day for being cured of scrofula from the king, or is that separate?
No, it wasn't actually. No, it wasn't confined to that. No, you mean the royal touch, the thaumaturgic touch. No, I mean, we know, I think that was done quite spontaneously. I mean, I think it was done liturgically on some days, and there is a rite for it. Anthony Howe, who is the chaplain at Hampton Court, has a copy of the rite, which he found actually, I think, bound up in a book he bought without knowing it was there. It's extremely rare to find. But we know Dr. Johnson was touched for scrofula by Queen Anne, and I think that was on a rather more informal basis. His recollection of it is quite informal, I think. I wasn't that informal because she was, of course, the Queen. But I think it was not particularly confined to that day. I can't tell you offhand. And there was variation between the different royal courts because the French kings did it as well. Yeah. Good, thank you. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for those who have joined us via the Edward King Centre connection. I hope they've been useful, and tomorrow I will talk about the Mass of the Lord's Supper on Maundy Thursday and the rites proper to Good Friday. Thank you very much.